Okay, I think we will get started. The event will be recorded today, so that will likely pop up on your screen very shortly. I am very excited to moderate this talk. First of all, my name is Maro Youssef. I am a fellow at the Strauss Center in the State Fragility Program, and I'm also a UT Austin graduate and a former Brumley Fellow for the Brumley Fellows in the audience. I have my PhD in sociology. So I would like to introduce three amazing doctors, female doctors as well. There's a dog here barking. First is Dr. Joana Cook. She's an assistant professor of terrorism and political violence at Leiden University. Second is, and I'm going in the order I believe they'll be speaking, is Dr. Inga Trauthig. She's a lecturer in terrorism and security, education, and senior fellow at the International Center. Oh, wrong one. Okay. She is the head of research and propaganda, the head of research of the Propaganda Research Lab at UT. And finally, Nina, who will be speaking on Hamas. Dr. Nina is a lecturer. Musgrave is a lecturer in terrorism and security education and senior fellow at the International Center at King's College London. So two people are joining us from King's College, or from London in general, and one person is local, and I am based in California. I wanted to introduce everyone, and I will let Professor Cook take over from here.
Thank you so much, firstly, for having us here tonight. It's such a pleasure to be able to discuss the book that Shiraz and I worked on for 5 years. With it's really been a labor of love, but we're very, very pleased with the outcome of it. Our interest in the subject of Islamist governance really kind of grew out of the Arab Spring period in 2011, when that kaleidoscope of Islamist fortunes across a very broad spectrum of groups were impacted. And we really saw a lot of contours of power in the Middle East shifting. They were in great flux at a moment that had been greater than at any point in the previous century, really. And we saw violent insurrections in places like Syria and Yemen and Libya dominate those headlines. And it became clear that Islamist parties were being impacted in several different ways. And we wanted to better understand those changes and contextualize them and help interrogate them and situate them historically. But political Islam itself has proven to be it's stubborn, it's resilient, and it's asserted itself across large areas of the globe. The predecessors of this contemporary Islamist movement are long and varied. They've existed in one form or another ever since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And whether by gun or the ballot box, these very distinct and very unique Islamist movements have sought power and have tried to govern territories in really a way that's tried to revive a kind of ancient Islamist regime. These events really accelerated following the global war on terror, and then again impacted by the Arab uprisings in 2011. And this led to a different range of approaches to governance by these diverse actors. But this was also very much impacted by the emergence of groups like ISIS, which when we talk about an Islamic state, most people associate Islamist governance with the group Islamic State, a group who imposed their vision of what this Islamist governance should look like in a very brutal way across an area the size of Britain in Syria and Iraq. And we first explored this topic with a grant from the Gerda Henkel Foundation, which looked at Islamist approaches to governance more generally in the Middle East. And some of the early papers out of this were specifically, I looked at the topic of women and jihadist approaches to governance, for example. And Inga, myself, and our former colleague Hyde did a comparative piece on non-state actor judicial and legal processes in Yemen, Syria, and Libya. And this book is really the kind of culmination of this work. And what we tried to do in the book was really explore in detail the complexity which surrounds these actors and the vast and diverse concept of Islamist governance today, as it's been interpreted by these very distinct and unique actors. And the 16 chapters authored by ourselves, including two of our excellent co-panelists here today, and global experts in their own respective fields look at cases as diverse as the Muslim Brotherhood, the Taliban, Hamas, Al-Shabaab, Islamist groups in Mali, including Katiba Messina, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the Houthis in Yemen, and Jamaat al-Islamiyah in Pakistan, amongst others. And these Islamist actors are not all the same. In fact, they differ very much on key issues of interest. And some of these differences range from differences pertaining to the civic and administrative construction of the state, their willingness to use violence, the exercise and rotation of power, and how they interpret and codify Islamic jurisprudence. And the book aims to showcase how different groups, so both those who pursue legitimate and legal projects and non-state actors who pursue them through violence, in different environments at different times, have approached aspects of Islamist governance. So I think it's always helpful to have a little bit of a definitional clarification here. So when we're talking about Islamists, we treat Islamists in the book as those who believe Islam to be a comprehensive political ideology that place this at the center of their identity as the most significant or the only source, who regard the political realm as needing to distinguish between Muslims and the rest, and who revert to scriptural authority, however they interpret it, either loosely or dogmatically, inspirationally or in doctrinal form, as the sole or primary source of law. Within this definition, it's also those who believe in an Islamic model as being necessarily distinct and opposed to legislative systems based on human reasoning, public opinion, and social consensus when considering issues related to morality and ethics, and who finally believe that the purpose of the political system is to satisfy Tawhid, or monotheism of Allah, while simultaneously offering its citizens a doctrine of salvation. So I think one of the kind of helpful ways in which we can conceive of these groups is if we think about communism, for example, and communist ideology, we can think of the broad range of actors and cases that were connected by the same ideology from all the way from Latin America over to China, for example, across a very diverse range of actors and groups and issues. And we approach Islamism with the same kind of open interpretation and concept. We also don't make a value judgment on Islamist actors. So the aim of the book was really try to consider what these groups were trying to achieve and how they're trying to achieve it. So the book was guided by several overarching questions. What does Islamist governance look like in practical terms? What tactics have different groups employed in the pursuit of governance to their goals? How has this supported or detracted from their fortunes? And what were the main factors which influenced the evolution or change within those groups? And we used 4 thematic approaches to consider this. That first thematic approach considered how groups have pursued constitutional means to achieve those goals, by which we mean a commitment to and participation in the prevailing constitutional order, formal political mechanisms. The second thematic approach in the book considers the diverse ways in which groups have sought to gain legitimacy through their governance. The third theme considers social welfare activism, or the softer aspects of governance implemented as part of broader governance efforts. And underpinning these 3 items, or these 3 themes, was the question of what choices and pathways have meant for how those diverse actors, local, national, and international, have ultimately understood, interacted with, and responded to these groups. Our final theme looked at how there was a tussle, or looking at the real kind of tussle between Islamist actors and the state, recognizing that Islamist actors do not operate in a vacuum, and they instead find themselves in a constant state of flux with the state, which creates a dynamic exchange between the two. We also look at 2 types of actors: constitutional actors who pursue legitimate political avenues to effect change, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood in many cases, or Jamaat al-Islamiyah in Pakistan, whose goals are generally to develop more Islamic forms of education, social welfare, judiciaries, and banking, along with recalibrating foreign policy goals in line with ostensibly Muslim causes, such as Palestine or Kashmir. And notably, they pursue these goals through political agitation, by publicly criticizing the prevailing status quo, pamphleteering, holding rallies, and where relevant, through participation in elections. And we also look at a second group, and this is one that's perhaps slightly more familiar to many of you, but those who would use violence either through insurgent or terrorist means to force change. And this has included groups like the Taliban, ISIS, or Egyptian Islamic Jihad. And armed groups in these cases have often tended to grow from ongoing civil wars in regions or from other political tensions. We also draw on two bodies of literature to inform our analysis: Islamic studies, focused on Islamism as discussed above, and rebel governance. And rebel governance is broadly defined by Arjona and Mempili as, quote, the set of actions insurgents engage in to regulate the social, political, and economic life of non-combatants during war, which opens up multitude underexplored avenues in the rebel-civilian relationship. So the study of rebel governance really helps us better understand specific aspects of civil wars more broadly, including violence, recruitment strategies, and sources of insurgent funding, and also things such as social transformations, political mobilizations, the polarization of political identities, and state building and war making more generally. Rebels too can engage in practices that mirror the state, such as symbols and symbolic processes, elections, diplomacy, and they can arrange different types of political institutions as well. And Islamism, in a way, can be regarded as a form of rebellion against the liberal order. They rebel against the status quo domestically or internationally. And this literature also focuses extensively on key areas relevant to our discussion, including governance as a strategic choice, constitutionalism, legitimacy, and social welfare activism. And we, in fact, divided our book thematically into those categories above. So we believe the pursuit of governance by non-state actors is not unique to Islamic actors, and instead represents another ideological orientation in challenges to prevailing power structures and political orders, and the practical aspects of this engaged in by rebel actors. So many of the cases of Islamist governance that we explore in the book, including ISIS or Katibi Messina or the Houthis, Al-Shabaab, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, they've all emerged out of states that have had weak governance or states embroiled in conflict and the power vacuums and competing power interests which often accompany these. And they've rejected participation in formal political systems and routes to power, and instead use violence and militancy to implement their understanding of Islamist governance. And while they draw on Islamic principles to justify their actions and shape their global agenda, their political agenda, I should say, they are faced with many of the same constraints, dilemmas, and choices that rebel groups more generally have faced throughout history. Rebels who govern impact civilians in multiple ways, including how civilians shape their lives vis-a-vis the violence, development of structures, practices of rules, coercion, and material possession to gain support from populations which can use ideology to frame this. And the support or resistance of civilian populations, is key to Islamist governance being accepted or rejected more generally. So we consider rebel governance as a strategic imperative, constitutional approaches, social welfare activism, and those attempts to construct legitimacy, which is also about shared norms and identity with that population. So that's a little bit of a discussion about the background of the book and how we framed it and approached the subject. So I'm going to hand it over to our two excellent contributors now to discuss their chapters on, first, Islamist parties in Libya after Gaddafi, old networks and new environments, and the chapter by Nina on Hamas and their quest for legitimacy. I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, I'm going to jump right into my presentation then. So first, of course, thank you to the Strauss Center, Susan, Maro, for setting us up. I hope this is going to prove an excellent webinar, but your support was really crucial in bringing this together. And then Joana and Shiraz, who put this volume together. I've learned a lot reading through other case studies, so I strongly recommend getting a copy for everyone who hasn't done so already. And as Joana has indicated, I'm going to take us to Libya. And I'm going to take us specifically to Libya in 2011 and kind of the following 1-2 years, but really focus on the revolution, the revolutionary aftermath, kind of the attempts of establishing democracy in Libya in 2012, which now seems like a very, very long time ago, but we want to look at that time, and we want to look at the moderate Islamists who were participating in the developments at the time. And the presentation is really based on the chapter in our book, Islamist Parties in Libya After Gaddafi, Old Networks in New Environments. And I co-authored that with Emad Badi, who contributed to the chapter as much as I did. And just for the Q&A, I have worked on other Islamist and Salafi groups in Libya as well, especially the Salafi jihadis in the country who also rose to prominence. So I'm happy to open up the discussion later. But for the presentation, let's focus on the moderate Islamists, specifically the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, LIFG, and the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood, the LMB. Okay, to take us back to 2011, I think we all still remember the enthusiasm for these protests, the enthusiasm and sense of liberation amongst the protesters. But then weeks and months into the protests, especially when the first autocrats decided to either flee the country, the first regimes fell, another conviction took hold that was popular at the time, namely really that this could be the start of a wave of popular Islamist governments across the region. So Ghannouchi and his Ennahda in Tunisia, they could rule the country finally. And the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, they could finally campaign freely and support the affiliated party. And similarly, of course, the sentiment also took hold in Libya, where Libyan Islamists were hoping to convince the population of their vision and rule the country after Gaddafi was relinquished. And as a side note, international observers and politicians at the time were often relatively supportive of these moderate Islamists because many of them spent years in the US or in the UK and Germany. So in some respects, they were actually a better known force than other local Middle Eastern individuals and groups who rose to prominence in 2011 at the time, but that international observers had never heard of before. So these expectations of popular Islamist governance potentially quote unquote taking over partially became reality, at least for some time in Tunisia and Egypt. But interestingly, in Libya, those expectations were based on really shaky foundations because the Libyan case was very different from Tunisia and Egypt, for example. And those were shaky foundations because of two reasons. The first one is, especially the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood, but also the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, were a marginal force in Libya in 2011. Years of repression under Gaddafi meant that most members were either abroad in safe havens or inside Libya, but imprisoned or just released of prison, but still under surveillance. And then the second reason is that next to this practical weakness really of Libyan Islamists in 2011 as a weak force inside Libya, parts of the Libyan population actually had strong opinions about the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood in 2011, and they were not positive. And this is mainly because Gaddafi, who had ruled the country, just as a reminder, for 42 years, he was in power. And he spent many of those years fear-mongering about the Muslim Brotherhood and de facto turning them into Libya's most vilified opposition group. So that's a difficult starting position, right? It's a difficult feat in 2011 to attempt basically a total 180 to many Libyans, instead of seeing the Muslim Brotherhood as this murky force that was attempting to ruin Libya, as Gaddafi had proclaimed for many years, to now seeing them as a genuine Libyan force interested in the good for all Libyan people under the guidance of Islam, which is what the Libyan Islamists tried to convey during and shortly after the revolution when they were campaigning in the 2012 election. So this is kind of the backdrop of everything. And then the analysis that Emad and I really did on our data, so the interviews we did, etc., we introduced four main arguments in the chapter. So the first one is, Libyan Islamists exaggerated their influence in Libya and understanding of Libya and overplayed their hand in front of international policymakers. This led to an incongruence of Islamist influence in Libyan politics in 2011 and 12, which was relatively high, versus approval of Islamist forces amongst the population in Libya, which was relatively low. Very quickly came to be seen in 2012 during the elections, where the Libyan Islamists severely underperformed given their expectations. Then second argument we introduce is I think there's a common misconception, and the misconception is that Libyan Islamists as a whole, or even the Muslim Brotherhood as a specific movement and group, are one unified bloc. That is not the case in our analysis. The Libyan Islamist spectrum is fragmented and competitive, and it fragmented even further over the course of late 2011 and 2012. This is represented, for example, in the fact that the main Islamist alliance in 2011 was called the National Gathering and was really like an umbrella organization, splintered in the end into 5 political parties by early 2012. After disagreements over personnel decisions, backroom plotting, ideological, practical disagreements, you had it all. But originally, this alliance was supposed to grow into one political party, a Libyan Islamist powerhouse that would compete in the 2012 elections as a unified bloc and hopefully sway the Libyan electorate on a large, and have large impact and obviously get a lot of votes. But instead, you had 5 parties in the end, which were competing against each other, of course. And then the third argument we outline is that Libyan Islamists, once in positions of power, namely when some of them were elected to the Libyan parliament, adopted largely uncompromising behavior. So, for example, they quickly refused to cooperate with the National Forces Alliance, which was the party that won the highest number of seats in the 2012 election. And this hurt Libya. Like the very nascent attempts that we had in 2012 at any sort of democracy would have relied on cross-party cooperation to draft a constitution, to demobilize militias, all of these things. And that did not happen. And that also did not happen because the Libyan Islamists were unwilling to compromise with what they saw as their main opponents, the National Forces Alliance. So I'm happy to elaborate on any of these points more in the Q&A. Those are our 3 main arguments. But I know that Libyan Islamists are far less studied than their counterparts in Egypt and Tunisia, for example. So I want to take a bit of a step back and introduce them. We also partially do that in the chapter. So who are the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood? Who are the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group? What's their background? What were their aims in 2011? And how did they participate in the revolution and the following political developments? So the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood, I'll start calling them LMB from now on, they have a long and tumultuous history in Libya. They're obviously linked to the global movement of the Muslim Brotherhood that was already founded in 1928 in Egypt. And actually, relatively early on, they migrated into Libya or started setting up chapters there. I mean, just as a reminder, Libya has a very long border with Egypt, so they're neighboring countries. And under King Idris in the 1940s, they actually managed to establish themselves, at least in nascent attempts. But that changed very quickly in 1969 when Gaddafi took over the country and established his version of a state, which Gaddafi called the Jamahiriya. And that really just introduced a time of severe repression of the Muslim Brotherhood, but also, to be honest, of any force inside Libya with some sort of political vision or political work or work that could turn political. So that is something that Gaddafi did not tolerate. In the early 2000s, however, there was a big shift. So Saif al-Islam, who was one of Gaddafi's son and his rumored heir, started his version of a de-radicalization program. So this de facto meant that Islamists participating in the program could be released from prison. Some of them could come back from exile to the country, but they did need to swear publicly to not just not engage in violence, obviously, but they could not engage in any political activity in Libya. So the LMB participated in this program and they left behind their status as a persecuted group really under Gaddafi. But they still, if we think about the vision and the ideas of the founders of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, but also the ones in Libya, they really wanted to be a deeply entrenched, influential Islamist group doing dawah work and then maybe eventually doing more political work. That did not happen in Libya. So to sum up, before 2011, the LMB consisted of a negligible congregation of people and was still denoted by an exiled membership and structures. So this decision about how to react to the first anti-Gaddafi protests in 2011 put the LMB in a conundrum. They had kind of cozied up to the regime in the years before, So even when they started to support the revolution, largely parts of the Muslim Brotherhood simultaneously appeared open to the possibility of making a deal with the very regime it was supposedly opposing. And these moves did not go unnoticed by the Libyan people, with the LNB's supposed cordiality towards the Gaddafi regime baffling them. Overall, and most importantly, just to reiterate, the LNB was definitely never stimulus nor driving force of the 2011 revolution. They rather kind of need to figure out their place over time when the revolution developed. So now to the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, the LIFG, has a very different background. It actually originated with Libyans returning from fighting against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And they chose Gaddafi as their next target. So they returned from Afghanistan back to Libya and wanted to topple Gaddafi and turn Libya into an Islamic state. Some LIFG members, however, also basically they wanted to do that, but in 1995, already in the 90s, Gaddafi and his massive surveillance apparatus discovered them, and the LIFG was basically dismantled inside Libya and also wound up in prisons. But they were eligible as well for this de-radicalization program under Saif al-Islam. So again, putting us to 2011 and the revolution, just as the revolution started, actually, ironically, the same month, the last members of the LIFG who's participated under the de-radicalization program were released. So while the LIFG was also definitely emasculated as an organization, in 2011, they actually had quite a few people on the ground who were very quick on their feet to start participating in the 2011 revolution. And these men, they turned into an organized cohort during the revolution and consequently decided to run for office. So there was quite a shift, obviously, in their thinking about how to participate and how to have influence in Libya. Another development that I'm just going to mention here is that obviously in parallel of those moderate Islamists now, the LIFG, who decided to participate in whatever nascent democratic polities, and the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood, they needed to convince Libyans of their vision, but they also faced violent competition from the Salafi jihadis who rejected any form of democratic political participation. And they were strong in Libya as well. So as those moderate Islamists, you needed to kind of cater towards both fronts in a way, or at least shield off one front and try to turn towards the other. So on the one hand, the LNB and the LIFG portrayed themselves as moderate and willing to participate in democratic procedures such as elections. But on the other hand, they needed to fend off Islamic competitors and kind of reaffirm their staunch adherence to Sharia in particular. Sharia as the basis of any sort of political system for Libya after Gaddafi. Especially for the LIFG, they needed to overcome suspicions about its past in Afghanistan and hence affiliation with Al-Qaeda that questioned the very notion of democracy. So the killing of Gaddafi in 2011 really triggered an identity crisis for them, right? Because their established goal was to get rid of Gaddafi and to establish an Islamic state. But then Gaddafi was gone, which means a main part of their identity was had vanished. And then the 2011 revolution, they participated, but they weren't protagonists in it. And the mood in Libya at the time largely was that Libyans wanted to try some sort of democracy. So the LIFG took a step back and actually had a convening in November in 2011, where the majority of some 400 LIFG members decided to respect Libya's attempts at a nascent democratic process. And most importantly, key LIFG members and leaders were inspired by other Muslim majority countries and believed that democracy was no longer to be viewed as irreconcilable with Islamic values. At this convention, at the speeches, Turkey was a very often cited example. And now I'm going to come to the final part of my presentation, where I'm just going to quickly lay out how they splintered. So we had this convening. The LIFG decided to also, quote unquote, become more moderate and set up parties and participate in democratic procedures. but then they crumbled. So the previous emir of the LIFG, Abdelhakim Belhaj, he unilaterally announced the Al-Watan, the Homeland Party. And Al-Watan was very much an umbrella party where you had some ex-LIFG members, but actually a lot of like young Libyans who the first time participated in anything called politics were drawn to the party because a lot of like locally prominent Libyans joined them. This caused like the establishment of this party actually caused a lot of tensions because his like Abdelhakim best buddies, Abdel Wahab Gaid and Sami al-Sadi, who were like together part of the LIFG before, had no idea he was doing that. So instead of joining him in the party, they actually established a different party, the Al-Umma al-Wasat party, and they had a much more conservative agenda and like reference point for it. So interestingly, however, neither the Al-Umma al-Wasat nor the Al-Watan party secured any party list seats in the 2012 elections. So their party programs don't seem to have been very convincing. But the way the Libyan electoral system was set up in 2011, there was like a party list seat, but then there were the individual seats in the first like National Congress. And via the individual list, a lot of those Libyan Islamists actually got into parliament. With the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood, they were the second most popular party in the 2012 elections. They actually secured 17 party seat lists, but also individuals. But all in all, to round this up, after 2012 in July, after the elections, we can summarize that the consecutive rounds of fragmentation that the LIFG experienced, as well as its inability to collectively strategize, given the new revolutionary backdrop, and the opportunism of its own members, actually rendered the group politically ineffectual. That's why you don't hear of the LIFG today anymore. However, that's different to the LMB, the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood. They continued as a political force for several years and actually had quite big influence on some of the big decisions in 2013, 2014, the first civil war, and they still exist, at least as a rump, until today. So I think my presentation time is over, and it was kind of like a summary of the chapter, but I know there's much more to discuss. Thanks for bearing with me and like coming to Libya with me. Since Maro didn't intervene earlier, I'm just going to hand over directly to Nina, and you can take us to Hamas.
Thank you, Inga. Well, speaking of groups which are politically ineffectual, it's a good segue. I would like to say thank you very much, Maro. Lovely to meet you. Thank you so much for having me. I'd like to also, before I start, like Inga said, thank you so much to Joana Cook and to Shiraz, who's not here, but thank you for your patience and for your guidance and everything. And actually, writing this chapter, I found was a really, academically, was like a really, for me, it was like a really beneficial endeavor, because it really made me hone my thoughts. Because in my chapter, as Joana, can you hear me okay? I've got this awful things that don't have speakers and stuff in my office. So as Joana explained, my chapter is about Hamas's quest for legitimacy. And I think actually when you think about Hamas, legitimacy is one of the main and most important questions you can ask about this group. But unfortunately, it's a question that isn't really asked that much, in my opinion. So obviously, at the moment, it's a difficult time to think about Hamas. It's actually quite a difficult time to conceptualize Hamas in many respects. So a lot of people are just getting in touch with me, friends and people, and saying, you know, tell me about, like on WhatsApp, and I'm leaving work, like, tell me about Hamas, like, what is it? And I'm thinking, okay, not now. And I might tell you when I see you, kind of thing. So people are just trying to get their heads around it, and understandably, because, excuse me, I've got quite a bad cold. Understandably, because Hamas is trying to be various things at the same time. And so, but it really is, but legitimacy is the most central question. So it's trying to be many things at the same time, because this is fundamentally a group that has gone, that is what we deem to be a terrorist organization, right? So by all Western standards, or not just Western standards, by most people's standards, most state standards, international organizations and institutions standards, Hamas is a terrorist organization, most places. But this is, we were dealing with, and I'll give you two of the main examples, but getting into politics, but this idea of a terrorist group who went into politics and went down the realm of the route of political participation in democratic elections and won them. But the problem being, it's not as straightforward as that, because rather than sort of going into democratic politics and saying, right, we will normalize, we'll moderate like a normal political party, like what we would deem to be a normal political party, they instead said no, and we're not giving up the use of violence, and we're going to stay as we are, but we'll also be in politics. So I'll get onto that in a second. So that's my whole point, being that it's a really kind of a branding thing, and a lot about legitimacy, and Hamas is trying to kind of convey what it is and figure out what it is as well, and that's why you do end up with fissures in the movement. And I don't have answers for what's going on right now, but I would love to be a fly on the wall to figure out, to see like what are the fissures in the movement right now after everything that's been happening since the 7th of October. I could probably guess some of them, but we can get onto that. So when we talk about legitimacy with Hamas, so there are two ways of looking at this. I'll speak about both. One is so legitimacy with its immediate environment. So we're talking about the Palestinian electorate, just the local the electorate within the Palestinian territories. When it comes to Israel, Hamas wants legitimacy to bolster its stance against Israel. It doesn't necessarily care about legitimacy from Israel, but it's to bolster its stance against Israel. So it's really about the Palestinian electorate and the wider Arab and Muslim world, and what we can call in some respects the West, but I will get onto that in a few minutes. So I will go back into just this moment. So, you know, Inga was talking about 2011 and Libya. So I'll go a bit before that. So back to 2005, 2006. So, oh, sorry, I think can you see me? Okay, sorry. Camera keeps falling. So you had in the Palestinian territories, Hamas had already gone into politics at more of a municipal level, and it was quite adept at providing quite effective like social provision. Sorry, one sec. Okay, there we go. Is that okay, Maro? Okay, sorry, thank you. So it had become very adept at providing kind of quite effective social provision, and a lot of this came from its background as being an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it had done that for a number of years, and especially it was providing sort of social services that the incumbent kind of political party Fatah was failing at providing. And then it decided, so it had sort of internally discussed the idea of going into the proper Palestinian Legislative Council elections years before that, but it had decided against it. And then during the kind of the Second Intifada, it matured rapidly in terms of it gained a lot of maturity from the Palestinian electorate. It was seen as a lot less corrupt than the incumbent political party Fatah, which was very important because Fatah was really going down in the polls. And it was also kind of capitalizing on its religious ideology. So that was more religious, Fatah not being religious in the way Hamas is. So it decided, right, we're going to go into politics. But this all comes down to, and what we're seeing now, and I'll speak about this a bit at the end, but I strongly argue, and I speak about this a lot with my students because I teach a module on the war on terror, on an Anglo-American security relations since 9/11. And so when I explained to the students, I went into them one day and I said, I'm going to give you a lecture about Hamas today because it just all started, and I wanted them to kind of know about it. And I said, what you're seeing now is kind of a subset of the war on terror. So we think the war on terror is over. We might argue that it's over, but what's happening now is kind of a subset. And the reason I speak about this is because back in 2005, 2006, the elections that Hamas went into in December 2005, which were massively encouraged by the Bush administration. This is all part of the neoconservative agenda to foster for democracy promotion in the region, right? So, and these ideas that, you know, if we have very legitimate functioning institutions, then terrorism just won't really flourish, or it might just go away, or it just won't become as much of a thing. It'll naturally sort of meek itself out of the system over time. Which we think was wishful thinking, to be quite frank. But anyway, so Hamas went into these elections, but the point being is that they were democratic and they were overseen. So what happened was they were in December 2005, and the results came out early January 2006, and Hamas won the majority of the seats. And there are rumors, I've heard rumors, so the general consensus is that Hamas had no idea it was going to win as many seats, that it was going to win the elections. This all, again, harks back to this idea of Muslim Brotherhood organizations or offshoots of the Brotherhood who go into politics but don't really want to win them. outright, because they're not necessarily the best at governance. But there are rumors that Hamas did know and was doing its own polling. I have heard rumors it was doing its own polling, especially within the Gaza Strip, and they really did know, but they're keeping quiet. I don't know, no evidence, but I have heard that. But they won these elections, and suddenly there was this absolute outcry. I mean, Condoleezza Rice wrote about it in her book. She almost fell off the treadmill. I mean, especially no one could understand, no one could figure it out or believe that Hamas had won these elections. So what happened was there was like a massive sort of panic. And when I go back to my research, it's kind of looking at how the Middle East Quartet in particular dealt with this concept of, the bullet and the ballot box, or the question of talking to terrorists and all of this. So this massive panic about what do we do? How do we deal with this? Because the elections were also democratic. So the Middle East Quartet, comprising of the US, the EU, the UN, and Russia, decided, mainly sort of arguably, and the evidence seems to point, mainly the US was kind of leading this, to impose like 3 conditions on Hamas and say, right, and so we're talking about Hamas looking for legitimacy, Hamas wanting like proper recognition, and on a state level, like, we recognize you as a legitimate part of the Palestinian Authority. Now, I'm not talking about track 2 diplomacy and everything that goes on under behind closed doors. That was happening anyway. But the Western response was, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to put these 3 conditions upon Hamas. We're going to say to you, right, you have to adhere to all previous agreements that have been happening within the peace process. You have to recognize Israel's right to exist. So not just recognizing Israel, but recognizing Israel's right to exist. And the third one was to renounce the use of violence. And so when we talk about these 3 conditions, I mean, we can go into them. I don't really need to go into them a lot of detail right now. I don't have time. But there was a lot of conjecture at the time that these were conditions that were put on Hamas, which were completely unrealistic, that the Middle East Quartet knew Hamas would reject these, and it would then legitimize the West's rejection of Hamas. So Hamas would come across as uncompromising. So we had this. So, but true to form, as predicted, Hamas said, well, absolutely not. Why? They talk about Israel all the time, but like recognizing Israel's right to exist is just, the argument that these conditions are put on Hamas and we're, expecting Hamas to reject, it seems to be quite convincing, because that's just going against everything it stood for. And wasn't going to renounce the use of violence. Again, it had campaigned, part of its whole ethos of Mukawama, of its resistance, is the use of violence. It's one part, but it is one part. And so all of this, so they said no. And so the West reacted by saying, fine, we're not going to afford you legitimacy. In the meantime, it's going to give you a very, very condensed history. In the meantime, Hamas and the other, hang on one second, my lights have just gone off. 1 sec, sorry.
Nina,
I apologize.
People are having a hard time hearing you because there's some echo. There's some feedback. Yeah, can you not use the mic? Would it be easier to just use the computer audio?
I'm afraid I can't.
Okay.
Sorry. Right. How are Inga, Joanna, how are you? Can you hear me?
I would just try and move the mic away from your mouth a little bit. I think it's just the
away.
Yeah.
Is that a bit better?
I think if you just use a strong voice, then it'll be perfect.
Okay, is that better? If I shout a bit. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. There's a timer in my office for the lights, and I can't fix it. They go out every 10-15 minutes if I don't move. Sorry, where was I? Yes. So is this better? Can you hear me all now? Okay, thank you. So anyway, so exactly. So the response was, well, we won't deal with you. So anyway, as I said, the condensed history. In the meantime, Hamas was trying to form what they call a national unity government, which is just like a similar to a coalition type government with Fatah. And it kept failing, and they had various initiatives that fell apart, and other countries were intervening, and they various sort of things, and all fell apart. In the meantime, the US in particular was helping the other party, Fatah. So Hamas and Fatah just hated each other. What resulted in was, and because the Gaza Strip is really Hamas's center of gravity, it's where it's from, it's where, you know, it has its base now, and it's where it was always most popular, and that's really where it's from. What happened was, in June 2007, so we're talking like a year and a half after the election results came out, they had sort of what you call a mini civil war over the course of about 10 days. People were throwing each other off of buildings. It was very, very brutal. And Hamas drove Fatah out of the Gaza Strip militarily. So militarily drove Fatah out of the Gaza Strip. And so that's why you have what you have now. That's why you have Hamas in the Gaza Strip and Fatah in the West Bank. You do have a considerable Hamas presence in the West Bank too, but the Gaza Strip is really their center of gravity and center of everything. It's the epicenter of Hamas. And so the reason I explain this is because I think as well, when we think about Hamas and it's striving for legitimacy and its kind of constant preoccupation, I would argue, with legitimacy. When you can read in the media about all the Palestinian authorities in the West Bank and Hamas is just in Gaza, and it's like it's not getting the legitimacy, and the nuances about why the Palestinian Authority is split and why it's split geographically and politically are kind of lost, which then I think maybe loses some understanding of what Hamas stands for in the first place, because there's kind of lack of understanding about what happened then. So that's kind of January 2006. So that was really like. So Hamas just said no to these three principles. And one interesting anecdote is that when these three principles, so recognition of Israel's right to exist and adhering to past agreements and renouncing the use of violence, the Under Secretary General at the United Nations, Alvaro de Soto, he actually resigned because of this. And his leaked end of mission report, it was leaked, I don't know, I can't remember who leaked it, but it's on the internet. So it's a bit like an exit interview. So he wrote this kind of dossier about why he was leaving, and he said those principles, the three conditions, they were never meant to be binding on Hamas. They were meant to be sort of guiding principles or guiding kind of suggestions. They're never supposed to be ultimatums. And that's one of the reasons why he just said, no, actually, I don't agree with this. So that's where we were, and that's why you have the split Palestinian Authority. So speaking about Hamas's legitimacy, so that's where we are with this kind of, it's more local, it's more sort of immediate environment, and where we are today and how Hamas is portrayed in the media. And so it's constant battles with legitimacy and gaining legitimacy, and it seems to be sort of, it seems like it really craves legitimacy, but then it acts in ways that sort of negate any possibility of gaining any sort of legitimacy, particularly from Western governments, which is where Hamas would like to get a lot of legitimacy, particularly recently. But even as I wrote in the chapter, its praise of the Taliban's kind of, you know, back into power in Afghanistan is one example. So, well, if you really are looking for legitimacy from the West, then praising the Taliban and saying how good it was of them to stand up to the US is very much not the way to do so, which also beggars the question of, like, had they run out of steam, and have they, and recent events, like I do wonder, it is part of the legitimacy question, but has Hamas sort of, in terms of its strategic thinking and strategic rationale, run out of steam and just run out of patience in this constant, like, quest to garner legitimacy that just doesn't seem to be coming? So I do think that is definitely part of what's happened recently. So you have the immediate environment, but what's also really interesting as well, when it comes to legitimacy, is that I always say to my students, and Inga, Joana, you, Maro, you might all agree with me. I sometimes think when you look at like jihadist groups or Islamist groups or any of these groups, I sometimes always say to my students, sometimes when you look at how they interact with each other is more interesting and tells you more about them than what they say to us and what Western governments or whatever governments say to them, what states say to them, and how states formulate policy towards them. So one really interesting kind of thing that came out of a point of interest that came from my fieldwork, and this is 10 years ago now, when I spoke to Hamas members in the West Bank, they really didn't have any time for Al Qaeda, and they were very, very critical of the 9/11 attacks, because they would say, why do they do that? America's so far away, it's so barbaric, it's kind of a version of Islam that's antiquated and just a bit just very unsophisticated. So Hamas does see itself as a kind of quite modern, quite a sophisticated Islamist group in many respects. But when it went into politics in 2006, it got very, very harshly chastised by Al-Qaeda, who basically said to it, what are you doing? You've sold your soul to the devil. You've gone into democratic politics, and you've lost Palestine. You have no integrity, and you're just effectively a bunch of lightweights, and you've taken the easy route, and you're not playing the long game in the way you should be. And Hamas took this view, and Hamas tends to take this view, which is quite interesting to me, actually. So when Hamas has this view that it's incumbent on the entire, well, certainly like Arab and Muslim world, it's incumbent on whether you are in Lebanon or whether you are in Indonesia. It's incumbent on everyone to come and help the Palestinian cause. So it's everyone's job to help them, but it doesn't work both ways, right? So Hamas does not think that it has to work both ways. So it tends to, and I'll get onto that when it comes to Syria. So it tends to sort of take this approach, or this response of like, I'm sorry you feel that way. So it said very little back to Al-Qaeda really about this criticism of going to democratic politics and selling its soul to the devil. It just thought, fine, and when I spoke to Hamas members, they said, well, Al-Qaeda's thousands of miles away, and the one particular member said, I don't really care what Al-Qaeda thinks about what we do. So that's just really interesting, and because there's all these kind of like grapples of legitimacy and where they're looking for it from, and who's trying to take it away from them, and how it brands itself when you think about that legitimacy conundrum in some respects. So as I've said, it's legitimacy with the West, and I think as well, largely, so this fury over this rejection of the acceptance of the January 2006 election results and the three conditions, there's absolute fury about that. But it until recently, as I've said, I'm starting to question now Hamas's quest for legitimacy. In some respects, I'm still undecided, but it very much wanted sort of legitimacy from the US in particular, because I think as well, because of US's stance in the world and power and diplomatic power in some respects as Hamas would see it, but also the US's support for Israel. And I think Hamas thought that if you could get the US on side, then everything would get a lot better. So I'll just give you two, well, one, I suppose, well, interrelated, speaking of legitimacy, two interrelated events since Hamas has gone into politics. So one was like obviously the Arab Spring. So again, speaking about how groups brand themselves, so kind of backtrack a little bit. And this reminded me of some of the stuff like Inga was talking about Libya. So Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and sometimes some people you might read, or it's kind of portrayed that Hamas is like a faction of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's not really a faction. So the word Hamas, Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, it stands for the Arabic word for zeal. And so Hamas has started as an offshoot of the Brotherhood and a separate jihadi organization in order not to tarnish the reputation of the Muslim Brotherhood. So that's really, really important. So when the Arab Spring happened, Hamas was very much like very pro-democracy, very pro the Arab Spring, because in Hamas's political consciousness, it had already done this. It had already gone down the route of political participation, been there before. So it was the vanguard, and so it was very pro the Arab Spring. And then when eventually the Freedom and Justice Party and the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood got in, the political wing of the Egyptian Ikhwan got in, Hamas was delighted, but the FJP didn't really have a huge amount of time for Hamas because it had basically bigger fish to fry, and I think it was just trying to sustain itself, and they didn't want to get bogged down with the bad public relations that would inevitably come with being too close to Hamas. So that's one thing. And then also Hamas had its external bureau based in Syria for a number of years, and when the Syrian uprising started, Hamas decided that it couldn't, because of its proclamations of support for the Arab Spring and democracy, it couldn't stand by and watch what the Syrian regime was doing to its own people. So it vacated its Syrian base, and again got into a lot of trouble with Syria, who accused Hamas of being ungrateful. And Hamas again took the view of, I'm sorry you feel that way. Didn't say very much. Also got massively in trouble with Iran, which is one of its main patrons. So I'll wrap up really quickly. Sorry if I've gone over time. So is there a change in quest for legitimacy? Right now, I can't answer that. I need to see how things pan out. In some respects, I was extremely surprised to see what happened on October the 7th, considering how Hamas have been behaving. And another respect, excuse me, I wasn't. So I'll leave it there. Sorry.
Thank you, Nina. Feel free to go off camera if you need to. And thank you for joining us while you're sick and you're away in London. So I'll keep my, we have about 15 minutes. So I urge the audience to start putting in questions in the Q&A. I have one question. Inga can answer, and if Nina's back with us, she can also answer. Otherwise, we can, Joanna, since you were also a contributor, you can answer this question. It's a methodological question, and then we can move on to more substantive questions from the audience. Tell me a little bit about your research positionality and your relationship to the topic that you study. I'm not sure if any of you are Muslim. I'm not sure if any of you are Arab or Middle Eastern. So talk to me a little bit about how you became interested in this topic and what your positionality has allowed you to do or prevented you from doing. Why don't you start, Inga?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking that, Maro. And I mean, I will only talk about my view and how I came to this, but like I do have a co-author who is actually Libyan himself and is Muslim. So I'd love to hear his views as well. Okay, but for myself, I mean, I came to the topic via like a long academic trajectory. I did my master's in St. Andrews and like Middle Eastern, Caucasus, security studies, etc. So I come to the topic from an academic interest, and while just spending time in the Middle East and North Africa regularly, I collaborated a lot with local researchers, and also, you know, I have a lot of colleagues who came to the topic out of a variety of reasons that weren't just academically driven like I am. With the research specifically on Libya and on Libyan Islamists, I have to say that very often, I haven't gone to Libya, but I spent a lot of time in Turkey and Tunisia. That's where all of the in-person interviews took place. And then with people inside Libya, it was via usually Skype actually, or WhatsApp, like online tools. And there are two things that I can say. The one for me personally, what I've realized is there is a research quote unquote benefit, or just like a way in that I have as an outsider. Who doesn't need to explain what Islamic background they have, or even regional background, etc. And even inside Libya, there are so many fissures. If someone has a certain Arabic accent, you know immediately they're from Eastern Libya. You might even want to know a bit more about them and what their motives are, potentially researching this. Versus I felt like me explaining my like research incentives and personally where I'm coming from and the work that I've done in the past and how I came to Libya sometimes gave me kind of like a bit more open door, simply I think because some of the Libyan Islamists I spoke to also had a curiosity about talking to me and like portraying their view, and like actually having someone writing about Libya who like quote unquote has no other baggage than like wanting to kind of like analyze the situation. However, when you do field like research and interviews, of course, there are like so many dimensions that play into that. I'm very certain a lot of folks I spoke to thought I also had like a Western agenda, or potentially was even a spy. I also think that sometimes it was easier for me to get an interview because I was a woman, and I was simply interested in speaking to a woman. Like 70+ % of my interviewees were male in the end, which is something we can talk about else entirely, but that's just kind of how the makeup was and the people who responded to my requests, etc. So I think about this a lot, and I try to kind of take something that is positive, hopefully, with my analysis and like potential ways in, but every second time, like I do interviews or do research, I ask myself that, and I benefit so much with collaborating, talking to local researchers or folks who just have like a longer understanding and interest in the region that I haven't had. I've worked on this for now like 6-ish years. But then also just practical things to keep in mind. Like when I would do interviews in Arabic, my Arabic isn't good enough to have an entire conversation of 45 minutes about it. I would choose translators that weren't actually Libyan, that were Tunisian, for instance, or like Tunisians based in Turkey or others, because I realized that actually helps with just like having a Libyan relax a bit more in an interview. So there was quite a long answer, but Nina's still not back on camera, so maybe it's just me who's going to answer this.
Thank you. Joanna, if you don't mind, I'm curious about, Nina, please tell us about your research positionality and your work on Hamas.
Okay, I'll keep it short. Sorry, I thought my camera was back on. So I'm Irish, and I'm from the south coast of Ireland. So I'm not from Northern Ireland, but I suppose when you look at the world of people who study terrorism and this kind of stuff, or extremism or anything, there's a disproportionate amount of Irish people in the field, and I think also there must be something subconscious about having it. And I think for me it was like the concept came first and the region came second. So for me it was, what I found fascinating was this idea of groups who go into politics, like groups we deem to be terrorist, terrorist groups to go into politics but won't give up the use of violence, or just terrorist groups who go into politics in general. I thought it was really interesting, and then the more and more I studied it when I was studying my master's at UCL in London, I started reading about Hamas, and I just more and more got into it. And at that time, a huge amount hadn't really been, not a huge amount of interesting work had been done about it. So that's really really, and in terms of interviews and everything, I mean, again, back to the legitimacy question with Hamas at the time, I found them extremely, Hamas is a very loquacious organization. It likes to chat, and it particularly likes to chat to people from Western countries in terms of like getting their message across, because they do feel very frustrated that they're not listened to and understood properly. So I did find them extremely chatty. They never asked me what country. Of all the interviews, not one of them asked me where I'm from, which I did actually find quite interesting. So I don't know if they made assumptions that maybe I was English or American, or I don't know, but they never asked me. So I thought that was quite interesting. So that's where I am.
Interesting. Thank you. We have one question in the chat. Feel free to ask others. I'll read it out loud, and whoever wants to answer it, Joanna, feel free to guide the speakers or answer it yourself. How does the nature of Iran's patronage of various Islamist governments play into their legitimacy? Is this a major roadblock? Thank you for the question, anonymous person.
Sure, I'd love to respond to this, and I will point the audience to the book itself, because we have two excellent chapters by Matthew Levitt and Nadwa al-Dasari, who look at Matthew Levitt looks at Hezbollah, Nadwa al-Dasari looks at the Houthis in Yemen, and Matt in his chapter, and again, I'd really point you to some of their excellent work and their chapters themselves, but Matt highlights how Iran has sponsored Hezbollah to a tune of $700 million a year. And what this really means is that the kind of patronage that Hezbollah has to Iran is very, very notable. And it's, this money is used to sponsor their social welfare program in Lebanon as well. And that money is used in many cases to support, to help them gain legitimacy and support by implementing that work. And in Yemen, Iran has supported the Houthis with training, military strategizing, weapons, and that's really helped improve their military capabilities and their overall threat over the years. There's been some training in Iran as well, and I think it's Iran's influence around the region and its sponsorship of some of these different groups and actors is very, very impactful for how these groups are able to function in the region. If they did not have this funding and support from Iran, many of these would be shells of themselves in really important ways, or the kind of regional dynamic in which their actions and policies and strategies evolve, I think would be much more limited in their impact in many ways. So Iran is certainly a major player in this space, and their sponsorship of their patronage that they develop through sponsoring and supporting these various groups in different ways is certainly an active and ongoing area of concern. Absolutely.
Thank you. Anyone else? I have many questions, so if the audience doesn't. I'll start with one that I think is relevant and timely to what's happening now with Hamas. But sticking with your chapters as well, I know that you don't have you can't read the future. So let's stick with the research that you've already conducted. Why do you think, for the American audience especially, why do you think the UK government ended up changing the Hamas's designation as a terrorist organization in 2021? So it seemed like there was a nuance and a distinction between recognizing Hamas's political wing as a political wing and its militant wing as a violent wing, and only the militant wing was designated as a terrorist organization before. What do you think caused that shift? And to challenge you, what have been the repercussions, you think, since then?
Okay, so what caused that shift? Well, first of all, yeah, so just to give a bit of background, the UK has a system of prescribing terrorist organizations. It's effectively a naughty list of groups that the US says, if you're on, so the UK government, if it's done by the Home Office, so if you're on this list, then it's criminal under the Terrorism Act of 2000, it's criminal act to support this group, be a member of this group, and various things. But it does differentiate between political and military wings, and actually this all harks back when the UK government was dealing with Northern Ireland related terrorism. So it couldn't enter into negotiations with the political wing of the Irish Republican movement if that had been on if that had been prescribed. That's really the history of it. So in terms of 2021 and when this was announced, well, first of all, I'm not entirely sure because there's a internal process in the Home Office of consultation, which takes quite a long time. Because I heard from, like, I know the Hezbollah one they were talking about internally for at least a year before it was announced. So Hamas, probably similar, but there are also, in the UK domestic politics and government, there are huge accusations about anti-Semitism. And I think that's why it was a kind of a politically driven move. Because I think with Hamas in particular, and I mean, there are 70 something, I think 78 groups on that list now. With Hamas in particular, it's like, if you think you can intellectually argue that there is an absolute demarcation between their political and military wing, I think that's an absolute nonsense. It's a complete false distinction. And if you think about their main leader within the Gaza Strip is one of the former heads of like their Qassam brigades. He's huge in the military, and he's one of the reasons why it's become so strong. So I think I don't think you can completely demarcate between the two of them. So repercussions ever since. I haven't really seen any major ones. I mean, I was surprised that there were, because when I was asked about this a few years ago, I kind of thought, well, from a law enforcement point of view in the UK, how are they going to police this if there's a pro-Palestine demonstration, like for example we had at the weekend, and someone is there supporting Hamas? Like, from a law enforcement point of view, is this kind of from a practical point of view? But I haven't really heard or seen that much about it. So I mean, it's very annoying. I mean, Hamas certainly doesn't like it at all. Obviously, furious. How dare you sort of attitudes at the time. But I haven't seen major repercussions. So my lights have gone out again. I'll be right back.
Thank you. I will ask you a question, Inga. Thank you so much for your chapter. We don't have that much on Libya or Libya's Islamists out there, so I applaud the work that you did, especially since you did field work and interviews in multiple countries. You spoke in the chapter, you and your co-author, about how Libya's political actors after 2011, including the Islamists, adopted the same political culture as Gaddafi. Could you speak about that more so the audience knows how that might have influenced what's happening in Libya today and the political developments after the Arab Spring?
Yeah, you like summarize it very succinctly, like adopted the same political culture. I think exactly to elaborate on that a bit, Libyan actors in 2011 and 2012 were put in a situation where they came from a political experience that is basically unprecedented, like 42 years after under one dictator who was like very eccentric. We've barely seen anyone like him, who was in power for a very long time, who even in terms of like what matters for Islamists, right? Like Gaddafi had his own interpretations of Islam. And you could practice Islam in private, but I mean, there was no one like in public who could have any sort of like authoritative interpretation who was actually a religious leader. It was like Gaddafi basically ruled practically, but also ideologically in the country. So the way that affected like the Libyan political stakeholders after 2011 was that there was no time for like a transition to actually like reflect about this. What does that to a population? What would do that to like political actors, etc. And then what we've seen, unfortunately, that happened with the Islamist parties, but also from other politicians across the spectrum, was that there was immense distrust amongst everyone because you couldn't trust one another under the Gaddafi system. And even though now was a new time and like the revolution was born and Gaddafi was gone, what happened in the like midterm when you actually needed to cooperate to establish a new political system was that those kind of like negative impressions and just kind of like harbingers of what you were taught for years and years and years prevailed. And in the end, you couldn't see anyone else as a partner that wasn't like from your close circle, like family, tribe, Islamists, non-Islamists, etc. So yeah, that really hurt Libya. And I mean, in the end, we had a terrible civil war that started in 2013. And like now in 2023, we have like the reiteration times 5 of this like divisions inside the country where for years, actually, it was framed as like an Islamist versus non-Islamist alliance, or actually Islamic terrorism versus like the anti-terrorists, which like is all super simplified. And that actually speaks to things that Nina spoke about a lot. In Libya, very often these phrases like anti-Islamists or like counter-terrorism were used to appeal to Western audiences to get like support for certain actors, especially in the military battle. But yeah, to like now 12 years later, we can definitely say that the international community, and I think like also Libyan revolutionaries themselves, kind of overestimated how quickly they could do like a 180-degree shift from like a totalitarian system of surveillance and like non-existing political culture outside of what Gaddafi wanted to a democracy which was supposed to like be defined by political parties who like just started from scratch. Yeah.
Thank you. I have another question, and if we don't have anything after that, I will let our panels go so Nina can get some medicine and rest, and people in London can also have dinner. Joana, I was very interested in your chapter on the women. And my question as a gender expert and analyst is, what about the women? We didn't discuss your chapter, but could you briefly tell us about the trends you see when it comes to women in these Islamist groups in general, not just Hamas and the Libyan groups and stuff, but in general, based on your own extended and well-documented research on this topic?
Sure. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think the question of what about women or where are the women has generally not been sufficiently addressed in this field, and it's getting a bit better. But I mean, one of the reasons I think that is with the rise of Islamic State in particular, you saw women joining from around the world and going and taking very unique roles within the movement itself. So often these Islamist actors would have very traditional or restrictive roles for women, but nonetheless, when they would pursue state building exercises, they would in many cases have to have gender segregated social institutions and public institutions as well, which means that, you know, you would see women come up in things like policing forces or in healthcare or able to take up public facing active roles in that governance system, whereby they could feel like they could more actively contribute in some ways which would appeal to a broader audience. Particularly, I think some of the Western women who went over to join ISIS were very the appeal of taking up active roles like that in the group was part of the attraction for some that went over. But in other cases, we've seen very, very incredibly repressive and horrific treatment of women, particularly those who kind of transcend the ideology, right? And so whether this is, the Taliban stoning women to death, whether this is, executing women who might commit what they view as kind of sins, not necessarily what we would conceive of crimes, but things like but the brutality that they would use against local women, and the ways in which they would treat women in the in-group, so women within their own kind of ranks, was very, very much impacted by what was their aim, what was their mission, what was their kind of strategic objective in that particular moment. So if it was holding and administering land, for example, you would also have to conceive of how you would manage women within that population which you were controlling. If it was a much more kind of light touch approach to certain aspects of governance, you might leave that to other people to do, or you might just impose very extreme laws, as we saw in places like Yemen under Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula once upon a time, which we still see very actively being applied by Islamist groups in places like the Sahel region as well. So you really have to look at these groups on a case-by-case basis, but in many of these cases, they are incredibly repressive and violent towards women. And yet we also see some women who adhere to that Islamist ideology finding meaning and purpose and roles within these groups as well. So it is important to really look at these actors with nuance and detail, and think about what are their strategic objectives, what are the tactics that they're using, what are their who are they appealing to and why. And the next layer for me is thinking about how does that impact not only women, but what other kind of groups are impacted in unique ways. Minority groups, for example, in those areas, as we saw very much so in the case of Islamic State and how they treated populations like Yazidis, for example. But looking at the how women are affected by these groups also makes me think a lot about how other actors or other kind of identity groups might be impacted as well. Sexual minorities, ethnic minorities, or any, Shias, for example, depending on the group that we're looking at as well. So it is an important aspect to think about, but I think that's just kind of a general view of the thinking around the roles of women in that.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, you covered different populations. The people who are recruited, especially from the West, the people who are the local population that are dealing with these groups, and then the women who are recruited within these organizations. So it's a lot. It's 3 different groups, and then minorities and the impact on minorities. So thank you. I don't want to hold everyone up. We are at time. I appreciate you so much. Thank you for doing this, especially at this time. Thank you for the rigorous and objective analysis. And we were happy to have you today. And feel better, Nina.
It's been a pleasure, Maro.
Thank you. I'm so sorry, all the drama between my camera and the light and my coughing, but we got there in the end. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.